Salmon seal, I have the Latin here as being Polygonatum biflorum, but from what I've heard from other people, my experience is with biflorum because that's what grows around me and that's what I've used. But I know people who live in different areas that other plants, other species grow, and I know people who have cultivated other species. So we can think about Polygonatum commutatum, Polygonatum odoratum, other species of true Solomon seal. There may be some overlap with false Solomon seal, and it certainly seems that there is. So there's different species of Smilacina, but I have less experience with those, so I'm sticking to Polygonatum. You would, of course, want to differentiate between them because it's always good to know what plant you are using. But it's a woodland plant with always a single stalk. So sometimes people will see small uvularia plants that look, if they're not in flower, they look just like little teeny young Solomon seal plants. But if the stalk goes up and then branches out into a Y shape, that is never, ever, ever going to be a Solomon seal. Solomon seal never branches, just one stalk coming up from the root. Maybe you can have different stalks, but always single stalks, never branching stalks. So it's a woodland plant. The stem will sort of zigzag, and the degree to which it zigzags back and forth as it goes from one leaf to another can depend. And then the flowers and then the berries will hang underneath where the leaves clasp the stem. The root of the plant is the part that you use. If we look at the distribution, Solomon seal, again, grows throughout most of North America, but primarily not so much in the West Coast. I have met people who, in states that aren't green on this distribution map, who have said that they found little small isolated patches, but if you find little small isolated patches of plants that don't grow in your area, you don't collect them. One thing you could do, if it was a decent-sized plant, or a decent-sized patch, you could collect one root from it, and you could break the root up into maybe 2 or 3 pieces and then replant those in another area, and it would grow from cuttings. And then you could actually wild propagate the plant through root divisions. So you're not actually harvesting it, but you're maybe spreading it around, and that will increase the production of plant material in a given area. And that's just something that would be cool to do for the plant, not so much so you could harvest it the next year. It's a relatively slow-growing root, the biflorum is. If you were to live in an area that had Polygonatum commutatum, the root is probably 3 times the size of the little Polygonatum biflorum roots. The Polygonatum odoratum is also much larger and much more rapidly growing. So in terms of if you were thinking about one to cultivate, I would go for one of these larger species and not the little biflorum. It's what I use because it grows here and I love it, but it would save me a lot of time if I had commutatum all over. It likes to grow in a diverse array of woodlands. So always woodlands, but I've seen it growing in mixed hardwood forests, and I've also seen it growing in very, very pine needly acidic coniferous forests as well. But it does like shade. It can handle some sunlight, but it prefers shade. Usually when you find it growing where there's sunlight, it was there and a tree came down, or it just spread out from somewhere that was shadier. Where I'm at, and in many places, Appalachia, it's a lot more common. It's a common plant to find, but there's never like lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of it. So you don't walk through like a whole woodland here in southeast Michigan that's filled up with Solomon seal. There's like a cluster of plants here, a cluster around there. It's kind of peppered through the area. Parts used are the roots, and the roots can be tinctured fresh. That's what I always do, but I do know people who dry the root and use dry root tinctures. You can also infuse the root in oil for topical use. You can also use the tincture topically for topical use. You could crush the plant up as a poultice for topical use too. Teas and infusions do work, but I always feel like it makes you use a lot more of the plant. And maybe this is because I learned about using Solomon seal from Matthew Wood. And if anyone knows who he is, we know that Matthew likes to use small doses of plants, so 3 to 5 drops. Solomon seal, I'll tend to use anywhere between 3 and 10 drops, but still smaller doses of the plant. And so if I were to go out into the woods and harvest a pound of root and make 16 ounces of tincture, and if I make a 1 to 2 tincture, which means that I extract that 16 ounces and 32 ounces of alcohol or alcohol and water, I can press out about 32 ounces of tincture. And in small doses of 10 drops, that's going to last me a really long time. But if I gather that same pound of root and I dry it out and it dries down to a little bit less than a half pound, and then I make teas with that, it's not going to last me anywhere near as long. So just from an ecological perspective, if you can use tincture, if there's not objections to alcohol that some people have, that's a much more sound way to use it because you can control the dosage. And you don't use it in small doses because it's a strong or toxic herb. Use it in small doses because it works, and why would you take a lot more than you need to if small doses work? And if you can take 10 drops instead of 30 drops, that means that your harvest and your tincture last you or your client or your patient 3 times as long. So primarily the roots that are used. The energetics of Salaman seal root is that it's cooling and moistening and mildly relaxant. The actions are that it is demulcent. It's decidedly demulcent. It's very mucilaginous. And it is a mild astringent and tonic. I think that astringent falls slightly short of the tonifying aspect. It's not just constricting tissues, so we'll call it an astringent tonic. In Chinese medicine, this is a plant they may have called a yin tonic. Very likely would call yin tonic. The uses would be as a nutritive. The plant was consumed as food by native cultures, and it still is by native cultures and wild food enthusiasts. Also as an anti-inflammatory, it lubricates the joints. It is an expectorant and a reproductive tonic as well. So the musculoskeletal issues, and this is something that I've written a lot about, and most people who learned about this aspect of the plant from Matthew Wood. It's specific to joint conditions characterized by inflammation and dryness. So if you have a joint condition and there's inflammation compounded by dryness, and I always think about this as a chicken and the egg, like did the joint get inflamed and the inflammation causes dryness? Or was there dryness in the joint and that caused friction and that caused tissue damage and then you got inflammation? Usually by the time that someone comes to see you, it may not matter so much because now both conditions are there and both of them need to be addressed. One of the things that I'll feel for or test for is, does a person have a sense of friction in the joint? So if they spin their wrist around, do they feel or even sometimes hear like a very commonly, probably someone who's listening can roll their head around and maybe they'll hear like a if that's the case, that to me says really clearly that there's not adequate lubrication in the joint. There's some kind of friction, there's some kind of catching. And you need to use something that's going to moisten the joint in some way. Physiologically, how that's accomplished, I'm not really sure about, but Salaman seal seems to do that. Sometimes you can give a dose of tincture, and within 15 minutes to, well, even 10 minutes to a half hour, you can see that that sense of friction is notably lessened. Sometimes it takes longer to do that. I've seen many cases where Salaman seal worked amazingly, and Matt Wood has written about many. One of the problems with writing about those amazing cases is that when someone isn't one of those amazing cases, they may think to themselves like, oh, well, this didn't work in 1 3-drop dose or in 2 days or in a week, so I guess it's not working for me and I'm going to stop using it. And that's a problem because most people are probably going to need to use it on an ongoing basis. One of the things when we think about lubricating joints that's important is that if you think about that combination of dryness and inflammation, most people will think about treating the inflammation, whether they do that with over-the-counter drugs or prescription drugs or herbs like ginger or turmeric. They're working on the inflammation, but often they don't address the dryness. And if dryness is one of the causes of that condition, what will happen is you will, even though the inflammation and the pain has gone down because of whatever you're taking, you're still getting structural abrasion on the joint, and that is going to make the condition worse over time. So I always think if there's ever a sense of friction in the joint, I want to think about using Salaman seal. We can think about it for Also, joint pain associated with all kinds of different causes. I've used it for people with lupus. Again, you have someone who has systemic inflammation in the joints. Usually, if someone has chronic inflammation in the joints, you're going to get dryness in the joints. I use it for people with statin drug side effects where they felt all sore and achy. And I've used it a lot for repetitive stress injuries. So someone has tendonitis or they have tennis elbow or something like that from a repeated gesture. That's caused by abrasion or some kind of friction, some kind of inflammation resulted from one specific movement over and over and over again. And I find that the lubricating the joint aspect of Salomon seal is very useful. You can apply the oil or tincture topically in the area that hurts, and I find that that's relatively helpful. For tendons and ligaments and fascia, Matthew Wood wrote in his book that it will either correct ligament or tendon problems where the connective tissue is either too stretched out or too tight. So it either makes them loosen up or tighten up depending on what's needed. And I thought that that was really confusing. Sometimes herbs are confusing and you just have to go with that. But if you can think out some way that that makes sense, that's helpful. And what I came up with, and this is just my speculation here, is that if we go back to this plant being a moistening plant, when tissues are dry, they lack pliability. So if you think about like an old belt, old thick vegetable tan leather that you see at a thrift store, you might see one that's like curled up and it's dry and it doesn't want to stretch out, right? And that's not constriction, tension. That's just dry and stiff. And if you were to moisten it up, it would become pliable again and it would return to its normal shape. Or if that piece of leather were stretched out too much and dry, it would stay stretched out. So if you add moisture, it would return to its normal shape. And so the aspect of, correcting connective tissue problems, whether they're too tight or too lax, to me is tied in with its moistening aspect. Moisture, pliability. So I think it restores pliability to the connective tissue. The fascia also being effective. Fascia is the real thin connective tissue that surrounds all of the individual muscle groups. And in my opinion, it is frequently underestimated as a major cause for a lot of musculoskeletal issues and a lot of muscle pain and chronic pain is dryness and stiffness in the fascia. I've met people who do yoga or various kinds of, stretchy or athletic or twist around in all kinds of crazy ways practices. And some of them would be like, I stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, and I can't get this muscle to stretch out anymore, to loosen up. I just feel like I'm hitting a wall. And I think that one of those walls is frequently that the fascia is stiff, and Salomon seal can help with that. I have also used it for fascia that we might not normally think of. Like in one case, someone had a rectocele, so the fascia separating the anus, not the anus, but the rectum and the vaginal wall had become really, really loose and ballooned out into the vaginal canal, and stool was accumulating there. And the woman that I was working with, I suggested initially, and this isn't something I normally suggest, initially to do an enema with some kind of an astringent tea, because that's just basically getting topical application of an astringent to weak, lax tissue. And that makes a lot of sense. But that's just going to work on the surface mucous membranes. That was mildly helpful, but it ended up helping a lot more when I had her take Salomon seal, which was acting on that fascial wall, which had also become weak. And then Salomon seal also something that you can use to help with broken bones. And I would probably use it with different combinations of things in such cases, but it would be something that you could think about using.